at say Erasmus University, we actually emphatically, it's inbuilt into our programs where students have to get internships outside or take a student exchange, and this is part of the undergrad experience. And we encourage them to go to places like India or the Middle East, or really push their boundaries versus the typical maybe the U.S. or Germany or England, right? And I think it's become fundamental. I was reading a very interesting article about the idea of creativity and innovation, which has become the goal of any academic institution, and for students to be ahead, or even be ahead of the rat race, so to speak, is fundamentally happening through the fact that their worldview is getting challenged. How is your worldview going to get challenged if you don't make yourself uncomfortable? And one of the deepest discomforts take place when you're faced with things that you take for granted, and changing cultural settings is one of the most fundamental ways for questioning that. So the article was talking about these diasporas, these cultural diasporas that are innovating, from the Indians to the Chinese, where their knowledge is being circulated, their social networks are being circulated, to a point that they harness this collectively to innovate. Because you start to see recognize a problem where in one context, which is an opportunity in another, and so you're able to transfer that. So so I would definitely recommend to get an exposure. It doesn't have to be another country. It could be in a different setting. Sometimes even shift your job and not get intimidated by that, because you can see that a lot of learning is transferable. So it's just making yourself uncomfortable is really essential, I think.
Thinking of technology, though, sometimes the word gets bandied around in a way that makes it sound sort of like a monolithic kind of entity. People will just mention, technology in the classroom, for instance. And it doesn't give a nuance to maybe that it might have from an international perspective. Do you find that to be true? Are there regional attitudes or preconceptions about technology in education, or how it gets used?
Well, technology across board, not just here, and you're saying versus the international settings. No, I think you're right. Technology as a term, as a concept, evokes these sort of preconceptions that it's going to be a quick fix, or it's going to be a solution to a chronic problem. And that's across board. There is a sort of technology euphoria that there are chronic issues, and at last we've got a new tool that will address it. Implicit in the term technology is something which is, it's a new novel technique when we talk about it, that has been pioneered, right, to address something and to solve it, or to mitigate a need, or mitigate a problem. But the problem is when we get hung up with artifacts, we isolate it from the environments within which we're functioning. And I prefer, say, technology spaces, because if we look at, say, digital platforms, these are actually, it's more important if we start looking at them as spaces, because then you start to see, okay, if it's it's a space, it has to be a social space. There's a particular culture of the space. There are particular actions that get reproduced within that space. Now that's very fascinating, I think. So Facebook is just by Facebook and what it allows you to do doesn't really mean anything, right? Okay, so it connects people. What about it? You look at the Facebook as a space, and then that's fascinating. How is it designed? What is the underlying infrastructure? Who is being connected to whom? What kind of dialogue is performed within these spaces and what is not? Even the absence tells us something. So it broadens our parameters of how we look at that technology. So yeah, it would shift perspective from more of a tool to a space, right? To create I would say, much more interesting, engaged understanding.